Miles Corak of University of Ottawa, you were at a panel at Canada 2020 here this morning where income inequality was on the table, and you're one of the great world experts on that. People in a crowd like this will be thinking both about what is the state of income inequality, but also what kind of policy tools do they have that are supposed to work with it. Sometimes I know people who are frustrated with this discussion say, well, it's just an excuse for talking about taxing and spending, redistributing income. You have a more nuanced view than that. Where do you think the debate should come when we're coming from seeing a problem to thinking about policy to address it?
Well, we should be very clear that inequality has increased in Canada unambiguously, but there's also a regional divide to that. But it's not just a tax and spend or tax and transfer set of solutions. Inequality is an outcome we have to worry about, but we should also be worried about the underlying process that generates inequality. And that process is very different now than it was a generation or so ago. The labor market is much more turbulent, it's much more polarized. And that means two things. It means, on the one hand, greater opportunities, but also greater risks. So when we think about policies, we should sort of think about risks and managing
risks to individuals.
To individuals. Well, take, for example, the decision to get a university education. And everyone tells us that having a higher degree is very important.
It's the most common response you hear in this debate.
It's a gateway to success. But which degree, in which field, and in which university? Those are very hard choices to make, and we can't expect 17 or 18-year-olds to get them right at this point in their life. And some of them will be lucky in their choices and some not so. So we might sort of think about giving people a little bit more flexibility if their education decisions don't turn out that well. If they have any debt as a result of that, we should think about a much more fluid and automatic system of forgiving that debt so that they can start again.
So I made a bad bet. I got a degree that I hoped would get me a good job right away. It didn't. I'm having trouble paying my student loan back. Is that, you're saying that should be, I should know, well, I'm going to get help with that, or it's going to be forgiven, something like that?
That's right. And in fact, currently we do have a system. It's called the Repayment Assistance Plan. But the students really don't know that much about it. And in fact, I think one of the great policies that the Canadian Student Association has put forward is sort of an automatic wrap, is what they call. So that through your income tax system, we know whether your income is falling off tremendously and you're having debt problems. So your repayment schedule is automatically geared to what your income is.
It sounds like sorry to interrupt, but it sounds like a kind of policy that might straddle some typical ideological divides in the sense that it doesn't remove the incentive for people to try to pursue opportunity, but it alleviates some of the bad outcomes if that doesn't work out the way you're hoping.
Right, but also at the other end, it could have other influences. A lot of people are dissuaded from going into some fields. For example, the professions, law, medicine, business, are very expensive. The tuition fees are horrendous. And a lot of people have that kind of sticker shock and they're not going to go into that field. But if they have a sense of more security and insurance to know that if things don't work out, there'll be a floor underneath them, that's really important. And it keeps people engaged in their own lives and in the labor market.
Can I switch gears on you just slightly? At the outset there, you mentioned that this debate has different dimensions. One of them in Canada is regional. I know that at Maclean's, when we've had some pretty lively debate about income issues and how's the median income group in Canada done, we've tended to use national data. That's what we fall back on debating. But is that wrong? Should we be thinking about it more on a province by province or region by region basis when we talk about this issue?
It's not wrong. All of these things depend upon your purpose.
Right.
The national data tell us a story. That's important to talk globally about Canadians. But it's always important to look at underlying causes. And in Canada, the regional dimension is one of those causes. Right. So I think if you want to fill out your story, it's really important to know that certain communities in Saskatchewan, many communities in Alberta, are just booming tremendously. Also Newfoundland and Labrador. So these are economies in which the typical family, in terms of income, is doing much better than it did 2 or 3 decades ago.
Right.
But in contrast, in Ontario and in Quebec, incomes really haven't improved all that much, and in fact probably a little bit of a downward trend after 10, 20, 30 years of economic growth and increased productivity, no gains. So that's really important to highlight, I think.
In the past, I've always been interested in looking at some of your research that has, and kind of heartened as a Canadian to look at some research you've done that suggests that historically increasing income inequality has been less of a problem in Canada than in the US and in some other comparable strong, economically strong democracies. But I know from talking to you in the past that you're not sure that we should be sanguine about that going forward. Can you just talk briefly about why should Canadians not look at our historic ability to do okay in terms of social mobility, people from
Right.
doing better than their parents, to do those kind of track record maybe shouldn't give us cause to be confident that that will go on in the future.
Yeah. Historically, societies have been willing to accept a certain amount of inequality if the members of the society know that there's a good deal of mobility, if your station in life isn't determined by your starting point. And my worry about inequality, and why people might want to worry about it, is that higher inequality, societies with higher inequality tend to be societies with less social mobility, where family background determines where you're going to head. And so in Canada, if you look at these data, we actually stand pretty good in terms of social mobility.
Yeah.
Family background certainly matters in determining your outcomes, but not as much in many other countries, and certainly not as much as in the United States.
Yeah.
But what we have to keep in mind, and I think this is the point of your question, is that the institutions and the investments that determined that were put in place in the 60s and 70s. And we're talking about children who went through the schools of the 60s and 70s, hit the labor market of the 80s and 90s, and now we're seeing them as adults. And that whole process was put in place when there was a lot more equality in society. So with the labor market changing so much and the wages becoming more polarized, we sort of might feel that we're at a crossroads and worry about how that inequality is going to influence equality of opportunity.
When people talk about the institutional underpinnings of reasonable social mobility, they often, these days, and including today at the panel you were in, the conversation swings to early childhood education and what happens in the first years. What's your perspective on that? First, is that a place that we should be focusing attention? And second, what kind of attention? What kinds of policies would make sense?
The early years are certainly important. I mean, there's no single magic bullet to this, but if you don't get a good start in life, if children are raised in a stable and loving environment with sufficient material and other resources, the playing field starts to get tilted. And so making sure that we're supporting families in that context is probably the most important thing we can do. Now, how we actually design our policies to do that, well, the devil's always in the details in these cases. And we had a discussion, for example, about whether early child support should be targeted on lower income people or whether
Income tested in some way.
That's right, or whether it should be universal. And there are trade-offs in doing that. What's really important is to keep the quality high. So, for example, the move to putting 4-year-olds into the JK system in Ontario is probably, I think, in the long run, a good decision because we can be assured of high quality of the investment across the board. But in other dimensions, we might want to target things a little bit more because you need sufficient resources to pay for what is probably a very expensive investment.
Universality is expensive.
It is. On the other hand, there's a downside to not being universal because people won't feel like they're part of the community, and some people might feel stigmatized. And if the design promotes that, then it's probably not politically sustainable and probably has more costs than benefits. So it really depends. I mean, you're talking to an economist, John, so in some sense it does depend how you design it.
Well, it's fun talking to you, and I know there are lots of other people at Can 22 who would like some of your time, so thanks for coming and sitting with us for a while. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.